All right, so why don't we do this? 7 o'clock, which is what we promised everyone. We get started. We'll be prompt. It's one of the tenets of being in Citizens Climate Lobby. My name's Sean Dague. I am the group leader for the Citizens Climate Lobby chapter covering the New York 18th District, just a little further south from here. And I'd like to point out Lori Husted in the back is a group leader for the Mid-Hudson North District, which covers this area and up. So if you want to talk with either of us or lots of other volunteers, we'll point them all at the end. I want to, before we get started, thank our sponsors for tonight. Graciously provided this incredible space for the evening, and we couldn't be more happy to be here. Co is a co-working space here in Rhinebeck, and if you are interested in such things, Johnny is our representative there, and please chat with him afterwards. We'd be happy to show you, give you the tour.
I give a great tour.
It is, as you can tell, it's a phenomenal space. And also, I want to thank, we had two of our endorsers for our approach. Suncommon and Dandelion sponsored the food tonight. And there's definitely reps from Suncommon here. I don't know if we have Dandelion reps in the room. Nope. But thanks to them as well. So with that, we'll get started. So a little bit who I am. My name's Sean Dague. I work for IBM as my day job. I work in the quantum computing team. I've been in the Hudson Valley for about 20 years, on again, off again, with that big three-letter entity. And a few years ago, I got really engaged in climate action. It became, this is something I've been interested in for a long time, but we really need to start. We needed to start a while ago, but this is a moment, and we need to take this moment. So tonight, hopefully over the course of the evening, my goals are to inspire a little courage in all of us, talk about how we build courage in our elected representatives to get some work done, and the particular approaches that we take on that. And plant some seeds about what's really possible. So we will start when my clicker is in the right place. I've been in the Hudson Valley for the last 20 years. I grew up in Vermont. This is the capital, Montpelier. This beautiful overhead shot in the fall. When the French explorers first came into this area of the Americas, they looked and they saw these dense forests everywhere. That's where the state gets its name. Vermont is the Green Mountain State. And not so green here because it's beautiful fall foliage colors, but something that I was used to, right? Just, it is a sea of mountains and a sea of trees. When I was in elementary school, I saw some pictures which were really striking to me that just kind of blew my mind about what kind of changes are possible. So I want you to pay attention to this picture. This is the Capitol building, two artifacts, the Capitol building and this train bridge down here. Because 150 years before this, it looked like this. And we'll note that there are no trees on those mountains at all. At the end of the 19th century, Vermont was down to 30% forestation. They had literally stripped the hills bare throughout the state. And why did we do that? So they did that because the economy was based on wood. Wood is what we built everything out of. Wood, we built our buildings, we built our train bridges, we built our boats, our transportation. It was what we used to heat our homes. It was what we used to drive industry. Vermont did not have precious metals, but it did have copper, and there was big industrial copper smelting operations that were powered by wood. And when they did that, it had a secondary effect of this all became farmland, and this is where they grew all their food. So it was always this thing of like, how did we go from this dense forest to this and back? And as with everything, it's, transitions are complicated. But a big part of the reason that happened is some of the problems we see today. Because at the beginning of the 20th century, we invented the electrical grid, powered by coal, and we invented the internal combustion engine, powered by gasoline. And that meant our economy no longer ran on wood, it ran on fossil fuels. It had the impact that we didn't need the wood, so the wood got to grow back. It also, these hills used to all be farms. One of the first uses of the internal combustion engine was the tractor. The tractor increases efficiency in agriculture tremendously, but a tractor can't do hills. So these farms became uneconomical in less than a generation, and they were abandoned, and they became trees again. In a weird twist of fate, fossil fuels brought the trees back. That's not actually what I wanted you to focus on. What I want to focus on is the fact that we have had a big economic transition previously. Our economy ran on wood, and now it doesn't. And so thinking that we can do this again should not be out of the realm of possibility. I am not going to dive deep into the science of climate change tonight. I'm going to kind of assume that we're all pretty level set on that. I will give us our high-level bullet points, right? We know that it's warming. We've known that it's warming for a long time. We theorized this in the 1820s. We had first models of it, like in the same time they cut down all those trees. 30 years ago, Jim Hansen went in front of Congress and said, I am 99% sure I can see the signal now. And we are well past that. So we know it's happening. We know it's us. Based on the isotopes and the carbon that we see, we are really sure about this. And we know that it's going to be bad if we don't do something about it. But most importantly, we know that we can actually do something about that. When we think about climate change in the Northeast, it's important to kind of think like climate change is going to be a little bit different everywhere in terms of what these impacts localize to. For us, it's the story of water. Because a warmer world means warmer air, holds more moisture. Warmer oceans make it easier to evaporate that moisture. And if you look at the fourth climate assessment for the United States, the Northeast region, that's pretty much the story they tell. This is about water. This is about seeing 20% more rainfall and seeing it in extreme events. So it's not just like 20% in general, but it's more really substantial downpours and extreme events. And the other thing is 20% is like, well, that doesn't seem like a lot, right? It's 20%, that's like a little number. But 20% for us is 10 inches of rain a year, right? And when that shows up, it's, where does it go? And we see that when we saw that last year. Last year was an example year, right? Starting in July, it started raining, and it kind of didn't stop until October. And the knock-on impacts of that were these downpours, flooding in places that people didn't realize we were going to have flooding in, overwhelmed sewer systems that then flush into the Hudson River. We spent 50 years trying to clean up the Hudson and then have these events make it flush all this raw sewage in there. It also means for us species movement. People are pretty familiar with the fact that we've got this nice Lyme disease epidemic in the region, right? And we get more interesting new kinds of ticks and parasites that move into the region. But species aren't just bugs that we don't like. They're also things that we do like moving away, right? If we think about what a business as usual scenario looks like, the maple tree doesn't live here anymore in 100 years, right? And that, for me, someone that grew up in Vermont, This idea that like the maple tree has no home here anymore is a really like fundamental problem for me. I grew up doing maple sugaring with my family. This is fundamental to my identity in the region. And then of course rising sea level. And sometimes people forget the fact that the Hudson River is connected to the ocean. It's an estuary. Whatever we see in sea level rise out there, we see here. And that has a couple of impacts. One of which is our infrastructure, right? Those train lines are only about 2.5 to 3 feet above the river. Yeah. And so when we see that level of sea level rise, our infrastructure goes underwater. Really critical infrastructure for this region. But there's also 7 big cities that get their water from the Hudson. And as the sea level rises, the salt line moves further north, and that water treatment facilities can't deal with the increased salt. So we're going to have a different infrastructure problem that happens at the same time. These are headlines from the Poughkeepsie Journal of climate events that have happened in the last few years, right? Extreme events. People probably remember the macrobursts and F2 tornado that ripped through the Beacon area last spring, which was quite a thing. When I drive down there on a regular basis, you still see all the tree fells from that on the side of the road. And that's what this intense extreme weather events look like for our region, right? Tornadoes. We talked about discharge. And then something people don't always think about, right? That 20% more rain, where does it go? You know, we had that rainy summer and fall, and when we got to September, 7 schools in Dutchess County could not open on time because they had to do mold remediation. Because our infrastructure was built on some assessments of past year averages and this idea that you would be that hot and wet all summer, that you would have to be air conditioning your schools when no one was in them. It's just not a thing that we used to think about. And it's what a new world looks like. So the important thing to remember, right, is our window of action is today. So this past fall, the IPCC put out a report about what it would take to stay underneath a 1.5 degrees centigrade target. The Paris Agreement was based on this 2 degrees centigrade, 3.8 degrees Fahrenheit global temperature rise. But there's a question of okay, but what would it look like? How much better would it be under 1.5? Is that where we really want to be? They put out this report, and the report said 2 things. First off, it said, yes, that's where we'd like to be. There are many things which the Earth looks a lot more like what we grew up with if we stay under 1.5 than under 2. But to do that, the baseline. We have 12 years to cut global emissions in half to give us a 2/3 chance of staying under that number. Right? This is aggressive. But this is what we need to do to kind of keep a world that looks not exactly, but somewhat like the one that we grew up in. And definitely halt some of the worst impacts of this. So we definitely have to do all these things because of everything bad that will happen if we don't. But we don't think about everything in terms of the bear we're running away from, right? The other thing to think about is let's say we do this, right? Let's say we actually get off fossil fuels in the next generation, maybe 2. What does that look like, right? What does a decarbonized world actually look like? If we walk out the door in the morning, what do we see? What do we smell, right? Use all of our senses on this. And it's a really important exercise because this is not just about the thing that's terrible that we don't want to happen. It's about the place we want to build, the world we want. And I can tell you some things I know would be true in this kind of world, right? I know the things you would see. I know that there would be no power plants with smokestacks. I know there would be no cars with tailpipes. And I know there would be no houses with chimneys. And And when you do that, some other things happen, right? Like literally, the world will smell differently. When you're in a city, a big part of that funk is the fact that huge amounts of pollution are coming out 6 inches off the ground all around you, all the time, spewing for free out into the streets. That changes the way the world physically feels. That's also why the sidewalk is sticky in New York City, right? Like there's all of this weird stuff coming out the backs of telephones. What does it sound like in a world like that? I live in the town of LaGrange. We're kind of up on a hill, so one of the sounds that we can hear when we're sitting on our porch is the engine braking of trucks on 55 coming down, right? Which is a thing which would be gone, right? We bought an electric car about a year and a half ago, and it's a wondrous thing that just quietly, silently moves through the space. And I mean, that's just a small part of this, right? What I do want, if you walk away with nothing else tonight, I want you to take 5 minutes in the next week and just sit and imagine this world, imagine what it looks like for you and for the people that you interact with. Because I don't know about you, but for me, this is a really awesome place. Like I want to be here. I want to live here. We've stuck a few feet over into already. We got rid of our heating oil system. I got a geothermal system, and it's like there's no weird oil smells anymore. It's amazing. And this is the world that I want for all my friends. This is the world I want for my daughter. My daughter's 4 years old. In 2100, she would be 86 years old, which is not an unreasonable lifespan. So when we talk about all these things at 2100, I always have this benchmark of like, she will be there, right? This is not the far future. It's her future. She will see all those things. So this is the world I want for her as well. So the next question is like, what do we do about it? How do we get there? Because hopefully, all of you are also in that same camp of like, that looks like a pretty cool world. I would like to live in that world. I would like that world to be created. How do we make that world happen? So we'll talk about the approach that we take at Citizens Climate Lobby and why we think this can help a lot get us there. Before we do that, it's useful to kind of understand where our emissions are. Because if you're going to design a solution to a problem, you got to scope out the problem first. So this is the U.S. And caveat, about 3/4 of our emissions, CO2 equivalent, come from burning of fossil fuels in various forms. About a quarter is related to agricultural and land use. So this is just focusing on the fossil fuel portion, and that's mostly just what we focus on because it's the biggest part of the pie. But clearly, agriculture and land use also have a piece of this. If you break up the U.S. economy, typically the modeling breaks it up into 4 things, right? So power is what we do to make electricity, right? So we burn coal and oil and natural gas and any other things. These are the emissions that come with that. And fortunately, this has been on a downward trend, not as fast as it needs to be, but at least correct direction is useful. Transportation is every car, bus, train, plane, boat, anything that moves with an engine. Industry, yes?
Why is transportation going up?
Most everything here is going up. Transportation is going up mostly due to increased air travel at this point. Road miles were actually the same year over year the last few years, so it's not driving. But we can dive into that later in Q&A too. So industry is how we make things, but don't think of this as manufacturing. This is sort of 300 different things of how do we make the glass and the plastic and the aluminum and the steel, each of these things, like how we make steel involves particular chemical processes that have fossil fuels as an input, and they're all different. And then buildings. So this is everything, all the energy we use in buildings except electricity, which means basically heat and hot water.
U.S. or global?
This is U.S. This is U.S. Yep. So we can imagine, we've got a lot of things we've seen, solutions in the electrical space, and which is part of why this has been on a downward trend. We've got the beginnings of things in the transportation space with electrification, right? I've got an electric vehicle, like those things exist. We could do a lot more of them faster. Some things like airplanes are a lot harder to crack. We have heat pumps, but they have like almost no penetration. And this one is just sort of a big black box, right? Because this is not one thing. This is like 300 or 400 different individual processes that do things in a different way. So when we think about climate solutions, we have to think about this entire stack. Because if we only hit some of these sectors but not all of them, that's a problem for getting to that world where we actually don't have carbon as part of our economy. So we'll sort of dive into what the CCL approach is here, and we'll start kind of a little bit from base principles, right? Like what is going to make good climate policy? So the first thing we know from the IPCC, 12 years, 50% reduction. This has to be something that moves big and fast and soon. We live in the United States. That means our relationship between the individual and the state is one in which we largely don't like being told what to do. It's the reality of the world. So solutions that may work well in Europe don't necessarily work well here. There's different relationships between us and the state. Clearly, if we're going to make a big transition, this has to be both fair. It's going to be done on the backs of the most vulnerable. And it has to be sticky. So when we talk about sticky is the fact that our political system is one in which we have two major political parties, and the longest any of them seems to hold all branches of government is 2 years. So we have to anticipate the fact that we are going to see ping-pongs in political parties. So we need some bipartisan buy-in so that we don't, once we move forward with bold action, we don't roll it back 2 years later, because that doesn't get us anywhere. And then clearly, like, if this isn't like good for the planet and the economy, like it will get stopped by lots of people in different ways, and it probably should. So this is the basic of what we have. It's a carbon fee and dividend model. So people over the years have heard a lot about carbon taxes, right? Economists will say this is the most effective way to do things. This is a little bit different because this is a fee. It is a fee placed on pollution upstream as close to the source as possible, but 100% of the proceeds are returned directly to households as a monthly dividend check, equal per adults. I will do most of the questions at the end. It'll just be easier. And hopefully I'll have answered it by then. So this is real legislation now. This is the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, HR 763. It was introduced in the House this past January. It actually was introduced in the lame duck session last year as well. It's up to 37 co-sponsors. It came in with bipartisan support, Francis Rooney and Ted Deutsch, both from Florida. And while we're D heavy at the moment, there will be more Republicans signing on board for this. The mechanics of going and getting co-sponsors changed a little bit when we had party leadership change in the House. So the folks in charge, you need to line them up first. So what it looks like, right? 4 major parts. We'll go through these, and there will be lots of time for Q&A to dive to whatever policy wonky depth people would like to dive into. I love wonky policy depth. So we start with that thing. We charge a fee on fossil fuels at the source. It would be as far upstream as possible, the mine, the well, the port of entry, if things are coming in off a boat. And for people that like numbers, what this looks like is $15 a metric ton as a starting point, year one, and then a $10 metric ton increase every year until we hit 90% reduction from 2016 levels of emissions. And there is a backstop that gets implemented a year-over-year set of emissions reductions in the bill that has to be hit every year, otherwise some additional measures kick in. So 100% of that net goes back to households as its dividend. Adults get a full share. Children under the age of 18 get half a share. And this is returned monthly, minus the administrative cost, which is legislatively required to be less than 2%. Then there is a question that will always come up is, well, what about China, right? It's like a totally valid question. Because if we just do this and we raise the price of carbon a lot in the United States and we export all our pollution and manufacturing in other countries, that does not solve the problem. And you would be right in that assessment. So there is this thing called a carbon border adjustment, which is we have a price, goes up every year. When we trade with another country, we say, what is your price on carbon? And we, for carbon-intensive goods, we apply a tariff at the border. This is WTO compliant language, which there's 3 pages of WTO compliant language in this bill, which confuses many members of Congress. We have to walk folks through it because they're not familiar with that. But it's designed specifically to not trigger a trade war, because there are provisions for this. And manufacturers of carbon-intensive goods in the United States that export to someplace that doesn't have a price on carbon would see a rebate, so that they would remain competitive. The point of this is to convince everybody else in the world you should do this too, and have them all come up with an equivalent carbon pricing scheme. Wonderfully, Canada passed a version of this last year. Canada's our biggest trading partner. Their price scale looks actually quite similar to the one that's here. So that border would be relatively porous because they're already heading down this path. And then this is our domino impact. And then in the process, right, of drafting 47 pages of legislation, there's a compromise made on the Clean Power Plan that Obama had put forward. Had some ways to reduce emissions at power plants, which the current administration has largely dismantled. This just says, okay, we'll trade that away because this is a much better model. This is modeled to have the same reductions the Clean Power Plan would have within 3 years, whereas the Clean Power Plan would get to that stuff by like 2032. So there's a couple of adjustments here. It strengthens one part of the Clean Air Act with the CAFE emission standards, so those become federal law and not just a legal precedent. And it's part of building bipartisan action is sometimes we make some trade-offs to get the thing that we really need. So the first question that comes into people's heads, right, is like, all right, you're going to put a price on carbon. What does that look like for like everyday people? And that's a good question because immediately people tend to think of like, what is the price of gas change? Which is a good question. And roughly, $1 a ton looks like a penny at the pump. So $15 a ton, first year would be about 15 cents on the gallon of gas. But we don't actually, turns out we don't consume our carbon budget. We only consume about half of it in direct energy expenditures, right? Being like gasoline as well as how we heat our homes and pay for our electricity. A lot of it happens through the way energy is used to make things somewhere else, and then we buy them. And we have bought the cost of that manufacturing, the cost of that energy in there. So about between 15 to 60% of average households' carbon budget is actually the stuff we buy or the services we consume. The other thing that's notable is that what individuals' increased costs under a carbon fee look like are quite different. They're different by a whole bunch of metrics. They're different based on personal choices, and they're different based on income. And so these are averages, household averages nationally, and broken up by economic quintiles. So this is like the bottom 20% economically, 20 to 40, 40 to 60, 60 to 80, and the top 20%. And we'll note that there's a substantial difference in what the monthly increased fees would look like. So when we do this thing, where we give everyone back an equal share, this has a very interesting impact, which is that lower middle income folks actually will see a bigger dividend than their price increases are from the carbon fee. And obviously, if you make then personal choices to further reduce your carbon footprint by either, changing out modes of transportation or where you get your electricity from, or other things that you buy, nothing changes about your dividend. You get to keep all that money, but more of it stays in your pocket because you're not paying increased fees there. And as one expects, people that have a big carbon budget are going to pay more, and that's the way it should be. This bill we have a bunch of modeling on the impacts of what this would look like from a number of independent sources. So it's extremely effective. When we talk about large-scale, quick changes, this is modeled to have a 40% reduction in emissions over the first 12 years. So for people paying attention, you will note we talked about 50% in 12 years earlier. And that was global, right? And this is the US. So this is not everything that we need to do, for sure. But man, right? If this is where we start as a baseline and then can do incremental addition on top of this, that's huge, right? This is a starting line I would be much more comfortable with when we start to talk about additional policies to target particular sectors and how we get ourselves to those targets. But this gets me excited. It's very good for people. So when this fee keeps going up year over year over year, right? And it goes up until we get to this 90% reduction from 2050. About 15 years in, this is what the annual dividend for a household of 4 looks like. So this is a pretty substantial amount of transfer back from these pollution fees, which is great. Because this also provides people with more money in their pocket to go and make the kinds of changes they may not have been able to make before in terms of changing out the way they get their electricity or transportation or other approaches. It's also, we don't talk enough about the health impacts of climate change. On the healthcare reduction costs alone, dealing with climate change pays for itself. And the number of lives that are saved because of increased air quality is immense, right? And so we're literally saving people's lives when we address this issue. The other thing, right, is there's been a false narrative about the fact that it's going to have to be the environment or the economy. And that's a totally false narrative when you take approaches like this. Because of this transfer to folks that have a smaller carbon footprint, where they end up with literally more money in their pockets, this has the impacts of being an economic stimulus package at the same time. And it's modeled to create over 2 million jobs in the first 10 years. And these aren't just green sector jobs. These aren't just solar panels and that. This is healthcare. This is other services. Because when you put money back in the pockets of lower middle income people, they mostly spend it, and it circulates back in the economy, and it builds healthy communities, right? It goes back into your community. Importantly, if we talk about durability, right? One of the reasons the Clean Air Act is still the law of the land and has had such an incredible impact is that it was a bipartisan effort, and it got defended in subsequent administrations, Republican and Democrat. And while, yes, it's under attack now, it lasted a very long time because there are a lot of people on both sides of the aisle that do not see that as a partisan issue. And detoxifying climate as a partisan issue and saying, no, there's a bipartisan support, it's got some Republican co-sponsorship out of the gate, we expect to see more of that, is important for building durable, lasting legislation to make this transition. And it's revenue neutral, right? So for a lot of people, even people that maybe count themselves more classically progressive, there becomes this whole I'm not sure I trust the government doing this with that or whatever. That's fine, right? By taking the dividend and fully returning it to households, doesn't grow the size of government. This is a thing that circles right back out there, and for a lot of people, that's a big selling point. We have a whole bunch of folks that have come out pretty strongly in support of this. These are on our website, the EnergyInnovationAct.org. You can see a whole bunch of them, but notably folks like James Hansen, who went to Congress 30 years ago and said, "This is happening now. 99% sure, I can see it." He's been a big supporter and part of that. And Catherine Hayhoe is another incredible climate scientist. We also have folks from the classic right, like George Shultz, who has been a big supporter of these efforts. So yes, that's Don Cheadle, the actor. Yes. Okay. So hopefully, I've got you excited about the world we could create. I've maybe piqued your interest in an approach of how we could do this at the federal level. But how do we actually do that, right? I'm old enough to have the whole Schoolhouse Rock, how does a bill become law thing baked to my head. At some point, I'll have to show that to my daughter and see how level of confused she is by that. But so how do we build that kind of political will? And that is what Citizens Climate Lobby has been about. And the easiest way to kind of talk about the organization is to talk about its founding story, which is Marshall Saunders was the founder. He founded the group about 12 years ago. And he did so previous to this. He started his life in the financial industry, and then he spent about 20 years working on global hunger. And he created this organization called Results. And this organization built a model wherein they created chapters of volunteers within congressional districts, Democrats and Republicans, had them contact their member of Congress, and asked them to support federal legislation to address global hunger. And they got, that bill every year, got bipartisan support in Congress, got passed, got increased year over year. They had a huge impact there. And then about 12 years ago, he had kind of an awakening moment where he realized how big a challenge climate change was, and the fact that the 20 years of work that he had done on global hunger would be erased by climate change. Right? This is a problem which impacts all other problems. And he's like, okay, so who's doing this model that I did? Who's doing that on climate? Who's taking a bill to Congress and organizing in every congressional district? And the answer was no one was. So he did it, and he started. The seeds for the carbon fee and dividend approach came out of now Senator Whitehouse. He was a congressman back then, and some ideas he was kicking it around at that period of time. And so the way this organization is a volunteer-driven organization. There's a small national staff, nonprofit, but it's mostly us, volunteers. We've got day jobs. We do our things. We mostly have day jobs. A few are retired. There's over 100,000 volunteers in the country. There's, I think this number is bigger now. I think we might have passed 500 local chapters. We're not quite in every congressional district yet. That's a goal for the end of the year. And so we're working locally on a piece of federal legislation, which is the Energy Innovation Carbon Dividend Act, and building support and the courage in our representatives for that. And we have a very specific model of change of how we do that, right? It's like we have a goal, we want to do that, we've got people, we're organizing, but how, like, really, give us mechanics, right? How do you actually pass a bill in Congress in a grassroots way? So the first thing you do is you go sit down with your member of Congress. And we become lobbyists. We go and sit and we say, this is what we want, and we would like you to consider you co-sponsoring this bill. And a number of us got to have that meeting with Sean Patrick Maloney last week. I'm losing track of time. So, it was a very, very productive meeting, and hopefully we'll see some nice results out of that. The other thing that's really important, right, is that, at the end of the day, politicians want, we all want to be the hero in the story, right? No one is the villain in their own story. We're all the hero in our own story. And what does that look like, right? We want people, we'd like people to like us. We'd like to believe we're doing the right things. But sometimes you got to give people a nudge, right? And so how do we provide that nudge and that expression of the support to be the hero here? So we have this 5 levers of political will model. So we meet with them directly. We do a bunch of media outreach, get things in traditional print or other media, because there's a lot of people that assume that if it was really this bad, they would be hearing about it all the time, and they aren't. And so clearly, it can't really be this bad, right? And so part of it is changing that, right? And I have to say, right, since this fall and a lot of the work that AOC and the Green New Deal has done in bringing this to a national media stage has been wonderful, right? We're actually getting climate change in the news much more than we got before that, and that floats all boats, right? So we're super excited about everybody that's getting the message out that this is important. We do grassroots outreach, come out places like this, or we hang out at festivals and fairs and have tabling gear and just chat with people. Say, like, what are you interested in? Does this sound interesting to you? Would you write a letter to Congress, which has helpfully been provided on all of your seats tonight? And we are hoping that you will before you leave tonight. And we will promise to take those. We're going to D.C. On the Hill on June 11th, and we will take those and hand deliver them to your member of Congress, whoever they might be. So if you're in this district, Lori and Troop is going to take them into Delgado's office. If you're from South, I will take them to Maloney's office. And if you're from somewhere else, or you're registered to vote somewhere else, we will get them to the person that's going to be with them on June 11th and deliver them by hand. We do a thing called grass tops engagement. Members of Congress listen to their constituents, but there's certain voices in the community they listen to more, right? So that might include other elected representatives. They have the will of whatever their population base is, mayors or council people or county legislators, state senators, state legislators. Might be local businesses, right? The big question is, like, how is this going to affect my district? So getting local businesses to say, like, I would like you to sign up for this is really important. And so when we get folks like Suncommon and Dandelion that have been supportive with us over the years to say that, that's an important statement to say that. And then we do capacity building. We've got to build, again, we're volunteers. So the more the merrier. We could go out and be a lot more places if we had more of you all to join us in this endeavor. This is the one that's... Okay. So tonight, before we kind of transition into Q&A, here are my asks. I have specific asks. I have my easy ask, which is we have distributed letters on every chair. That's a letter to a member of Congress that says, I would like you to co-sponsor this bill. Neither Maloney nor Delgado have co-sponsored yet, so we would love to have more letters supporting that. If you can do that, that would be great. If you'd like to learn more about the organization and how we do things, At the bottom of that letter, there's a checkbox that says, like, put me on your list. That will get you on the national list, which will get you an invite to an intro call. Every Wednesday night at 8 o'clock, they do this intro call where they talk about the organization, the way we do things, and then open up for Q&A. And that's with national staff. And everyone is welcome. It's an open call. And they record it, and you can also listen to it later if you can't make the time. If you are someone that is in that grass tops kind of camp, right? A local business owner, or an elected official, or a community organizer, or leader of a religious institution, or someone in one of these kinds of roles, consider endorsing the bill as your business or your organization. That helps a lot, right? I realize that's not always like the comfortable thing to do, but we're kind of beyond our comfort zones now. And that's a big part of what being courageous is. It's like, yeah, we didn't used to do that, but if we're going to make some impact, we kind of have to now. And then if you want to learn more, Lori's got some information in the back about our organizing meeting. We have an open organizing meeting, each of us once a month. I'm down in Beacon, Lori's up at Bard. And the volunteers, can I just get all volunteers that are in the room right now to raise their hand so you can talk with any of them afterwards? We are infiltrated. So most of them have little stickers and stuff with the logo. But yeah, so like if you're interested in becoming very actively engaged, we love that too. So, a couple years ago, I did not anticipate that I would be up here speaking in front of a bunch of people saying like, hey, we got to do this thing. That was not in my game plan. My game plan changed. This organization was a huge part of helping me do that, because not only are we pushing on policy, but they spend a lot of time. I've never worked with an organization that spent so much time on volunteer training. What do you have to do to be in a lobby session with a member of Congress and be effective? And practice and training on these things, on doing outreach in ways that you might not have expected. So in terms of individual growth, it's an incredible group to be a part of. And so, join us in creating, courage in yourself, in our family and friends, talk about climate change with them, and do what's required to get our elected representatives courage to do the right things here. And we can still do this. That's the important thing we've got to remember. We've got a window, and that window is now. So with that, I want to thank you for coming out tonight. And we'll do questions for a bit, and then we got some things. All right. Question there. Yep.
What's your opinion on, two questions. What's your opinion on Green New Deal?
Yep.
Second question, what's your opinion about why those who are in charge of our destiny are, their behavior? What is it that drives them to continue to be on the wrong path?
Mm-hmm. Okay, sure. So two-part question. I'll go with the first part first. So what do we think about the Green New Deal? I am personally pretty excited about the Green New Deal from the fact of the conversation that it started, right? The Green New Deal is 4 pages of a non-binding resolution that sets up sort of some big ideas, right? Big ideas are great. And we need to be talking in big ideas, and what it has done to change the national conversation has been wonderful, right? Like I said, when people didn't hear about it in the news, they thought it wasn't important, and that is changing. And a huge amount of that changing is thanks to them, and that's incredible. We have slightly different theories on change, where I think that the approach that we have here is completely compatible with all the goals that they've set forward. And we think it could actually be implemented even sooner, because you don't need to flip all the segments of national government to do so. We still, as an organization, believe this is the best first step, because it can happen actually sooner than you think. But again, like I said, it's not the whole solution. There's some great ideas in the Green New Deal, and all hands on deck, right? Like, we're at the point where we got to have all hands on deck. On the second question about what motivates people not to change, change is hard, right? I've worked in big companies for a large part of my life, and anytime you want to get people to change things, regardless of that it's going to be better in the end, like, there's lots of fear around, like, what does that mean for, like, my airplanes or my whatever, right? Like, there's fear. And we need to overcome that with the fact that, like, that's not, we're not going to live in a cold, dark world, right? That's not actually the world we need to create. We can create this, like, better, awesomer electric world that we all want to live in, right? It doesn't have to be a terrible sacrifice to get there. So, all right, did I answer your question? All right, I'm going to jump there, and I'll jump back.
Okay. I have two fairly quick questions.
Yep.
So one is, I just want to know who pays and how do they pay?
Yep.
That's simple.
Yep. So who pays and how do they pay? So the fee is going to be assessed upstream, right? So it turns out that every mine, every oil well has to report to the federal government monthly what they pulled out of the ground, because there's some permitting and things associated with that. So they're already telling the federal government how many tons of coal came out. And when they do that, they'll be like, okay, and then this amount of coal has this much carbon because it's going to get burned, and that's what you have to pay. So they will pay that upstream. That will have a knock-on impact that things become more expensive. And so you would see that in indirect price increases, and then the dividends about offsetting that.
Okay, the second question, which is very related,
Yep.
is that, so it seems like the idea or the hope is that businesses that have to do this will decide to look into more sustainable options, or people will also do that.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a guarantee?
It's not a guarantee. That being said, do people remember the summer of $4 gas? Right? Like, in like a year, people changed their car buying habits. And then they went back when gas went cheap again, right? But it does, like, we have more scientific modeling evidence, and we have anecdotal evidence that these do cause behavior change. The other thing that it does, because it's a predictable price curve on what the rising price of carbon would be, because here's a straight line. It's a straight line for 30 years to get us to where we need to be, and a pretty aggressive slope, is the hope. And it's hard to model, but there's a lot of evidence that this would happen. Is this opens up for a lot of innovation and disruption of these industries. Of like, all right, how do you make steel without coke? Right? Like, who's going to invest in that today? Nobody. Like, coal's too cheap. But like, when you see that happening, it's like, oh, there's a business opportunity there. Like, there's a lot of private capital that invests in weird smartphone apps today, right? That like, hopefully we can unlock to say, look, we're giving you this giant opportunity. Like, these things are going to get more expensive. You find a way to do it without it, you get a brand new market, and you get to drive that switching of all these people to low carbon versions of making steel, aluminum, whatever, right? Better heat pumps, better electric cars. Cool. We'll do there, and I'll come back. Or did you still have one?
Yes.
You had your hand up last. We'll do that. Okay.
Okay. Everyone must know about Michael Pence opening the Arctic, and that is very scary. Is anything being done to stop him right at the track, on the track, before he goes any further? That is very scary.
Yeah. So the question is about the current opening of the Arctic to potential fossil fuel exploration. That's not in the realm of things that we're working on, because we're focused on legislative stuff. There are folks that are challenging that at legal levels. And again, that's about being within an ecosystem of groups working on climate. Like, we are not the only one. We are we are pushing a federal legislative approach. There are people that are pushing judicial approaches, right? Like
I know Sarah Club. I'm a member of that, and
Okay.
we're doing a lot of good work over there.
Yep, for sure, right? So that's the thing, right? This is what's great, right? This is an ecosystem of folks working towards the same end game with different approaches. We don't know all which ones are going to pay off, so we got to try them all because we're at the point where all hands on deck.
And another thing is that Donald Trump speaks street language. I'm very funny.
Sure, I'll.
And that's why this is the concept that we have to make it a street talk to the masses to put Donald Trump on the right track.
Okay.
Can we do that? I think we can do that.
Hey, if you got a plan for that, like, I would love to know what it is. That would be cool. All right. So we had a hand there, and then we had Tim, and then. Okay. Yes.
Sean, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. I just wanted to clarify to see if I'm understanding this correctly. This fee, it will only apply to industrial producers, so not to agricultural?
So it's about
The second?
fossil fuels that are going to be burned.
Okay,
Yes.
so nothing, although it may directly impact, for example, the production of fertilizers.
It may. So some of these processes become complicated in where fossil fuels generate emissions and don't generate emissions. And so this is about fossil fuels and a few other things. It's CO2 equivalent, so like fluorinated gases and some other stuff are covered too. But it's about them being emitted.
Okay. And then I guess it's two short questions,
Yep.
if I may. So one, just to review the basis by which the dividend is distributed to Americans.
Mhm.
And then I had a question how this federal program would work with, there are several state, regional cap and trade systems.
Yep, absolutely. So the exact mechanisms of distribution are not given in the bill. It's given a directive. The program is run under the Department of Treasury. The requirements are that it has to be distributed monthly. The expectation, so about 85% of us that file taxes do so and get our refund via direct deposit. So Department of Treasury already has a way to route you for about 85% of us. For folks that do not currently file taxes because they don't have to because they're below an income threshold or don't have their direct
But
deposit on
is
file.
it the same amount for all Americans?
Yep.
And then less for children? So it's not based on your carbon consumption?
It's
or
not.
income?
Yep.
Okay.
So the incentive to you is you're going to keep getting this check, and it's going to go up every year for a while until our emissions come down so much the checks start getting smaller.
Something like Alaska.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the Alaska Permanent Fund. It's very much like that, right? And so your incentive is like if you change your behavior and use and generate less emissions, like you just get to like use that money for whatever you like to use that money for, right? And we're making no judgments, right? So cool. All right. So Tim. Oh, sorry. You had a second part of the question. Yes,
For
state.
example, New York is part of the
Reggie.
cap and trade
Yep.
systems. This would be a federal law. Will it supplant?
It does not. So the last stanza of the bill is that this does not supplant any existing state or local regulation. So this would right on top. Now, that being said, the real impact on something like Reggie would probably be, so Reggie trades about $4 a ton. It's an auction, it varies, but that's sort of where it's been. Has a floor of 2 by law. This would drive emissions down so much faster than Reggie's having an impact on that it would basically take cap and trade systems to their floors because there would be more allotments than could be auctioned. So they could change their targets and be more aggressive. But it will have some, the economics of complex systems mean it will impact there. But it does not supplant anything. And if a state wants to go further, pass their own carbon fee, because that's actually been floated a couple times in New York State, for instance, that's cool, right? Rides on top, it's fine. Tim.
Is there a necessity for regulatory oversight to make sure upstream reporting is consistent with production?
So that's a good point, right? So this is the question of like, how badly could someone cheat on this, right? That's sort of like the crux of the question, right? So yes. So there will need to be sure that our upstream accounting looks correct and is actually accounting for like the real greenhouse gas emissions of that. That's sort of part of the direction of the bill, that accounting is done accurately. You will have to, yes, we have to do that right. Otherwise, it doesn't work, or it doesn't work as effectively. Yep. There.
I'm still a little fuzzy on how the rest of the world gets on board with this, because we can do all of this, and that's great, and we're at 25% of emissions, I think. But I mean, you sort of, just kind of touched on, well, China will be in their interest or whatever, and I'm not saying it won't, but it just seems like there's a huge enough job for us to get it done here. And how we can get everybody else to subscribe, I'm just not really.
Sure. So there's sort of two knock-on effects, right? The theory is there's two knock-on effects. So the first is direct, right? The carbon border adjustment is like a real thing, where like pretty substantial, steep fees of products coming in that have substantial carbon emissions, they'll see a huge tariff at the border. And that provides an incentive. Like, the United States is the biggest consumer of goods worldwide. You want to sell in this market? Like, go work in this model. And then you will be able to sell across this market. This actually fixes a problem we have today. Whereas when you do the accounting, it's like, oh, the United States is like the second biggest emitter, but only because the emissions of all the stuff we buy is not accounted to us. It's over there. So when you start doing that math, it gets a little more complicated, and we kind of look a little more like number one again. So it addresses that part of the segment directly. And there's some reason to believe, based on things that have happened in past trade policy, that it will have that sort of knock-on effect. The other thing is that by unlocking some of the innovation and private capital in building some very low carbon technologies here, we also, the hope is we build them here and we export them to the rest of the world as well. And so, it's a little bit like a Marshall Plan of, we're going to build a lot of the right technology here, and we're going to make that technology available, sell it other places in the world, and that will help kickstart other folks to get there as well. That's a little more speculative, but like, you can kind of see how a dotted line works there. We'll do this. Where are we at for time? I will do two more questions, and then we will. There's cupcakes, right? So like, clearly, we don't want to miss out on the cupcakes. So I will do there and there. Yeah.
Is that dividend taxable?
It is taxable. Yeah.
Any thoughts of designating that extra revenue for other energy programs as opposed to making it unassigned to the government?
So within this program, it comes back as taxable income. There's a couple of reasons for that. One of which is that there's, for the intricacies of how Washington works, there's this whole pay-go system. Whereas if a bill like raises the deficit over some period of time, then all these other things automatically get cut, and it's a way to handle that. It also actually makes it a little more fair, because people on lower income that don't pay taxes don't actually see it taxed. We did make sure in the bill there's language that for programs that are currently means tested, like SNAP and Medicaid, it does not count as income for means testing for those programs. So it's an important thing not to like, hey, you got this dividend and it just knocked you off of SNAP, right? Like, that's not a thing that's the thing we want to be very careful like didn't do. So that's language that's in the bill. When it comes to like check a box to like send it off into some other program, that's not a part of what's here. And what I would say is, you get your dividend check, you're free to do with it whatever you want to do with it, right? And if you want to do with it to go invest in more solar panels or do this, like, that's great. That's actually what we'd like to see. and so you get to make that or donate it to a cause, like,
Or take an airplane.
or take an airplane trip. Fortunately, maybe not. Maybe not. We'd like to do a few less of those. Yeah. So, and I'll take that as the last question.
Thanks, John. It's really great. It's very, very cool work. I work at Food and Water Watch, so I'm in that ecosystem.
Nice. We need to meet, actually.
Can you give us the quickest, the last, so I remember when carbon pricing, when there was a bill in 2003, 2008,
Yep.
2000, so what is it really that, I'm convinced. Why are you convinced that Republicans could actually get on this versus the 2003 bill, which I think McCain actually was the sponsor of, and it was a dividend. It wasn't, because originally, well, anyway, you could explain it better than me. I don't remember it that well.
So the answer is, haven't we been here before? And the answer is sort of, right?
I know.
So
it's changed, though.
yeah. So a lot has changed. I think that one of the things that Citizens Climate Lobby worked on while we were introducing this bill is helping build the Climate Solutions Caucus in Congress, which right before the last election had 45 Democrats and 45 Republicans in it, where they could actually sit down and talk about climate solutions in kind of a detoxified way. That existed for 2 years. It changed the conversation. We know it changed the conversation by the fact that when we got the bill introduced last session, it showed up with 3 Republicans in the House, and it got introduced in the Senate bipartisan as well. Jeff Flake introduced it before he left. And there are more, we got it reintroduced with Rooney as a lead co-sponsor, and there will be more coming. So we know the support's there. We actually, turns out, spending 10 years sitting down with congressional offices, you kind of can watch the gauge move, and you can see the support moves. It is a little different than the last time around because the cap and trade model, it's hard to scale those things down when you're trying to do things like deal with automobiles, right? And so a more simple carbon fee and dividend model, we think the time's sort of ripe right now. Lots of other places in that meantime have done both cap and trade, and we have it in the Northeast, right, with Reggie, but it's just covers 15% of emissions because it's large power plants. And countries in Europe have done carbon taxes. Canada's the first one to do this. You get they only give the rebate back once a year. But when we think about durability, the statement around the Alaska Permanent Fund is really important, right? That is a program, for people who aren't aware, where Alaska makes a lot of money off fossil fuels, so much so that they just give a check to every single person that lives in the state every year. And it is an incredibly popular program, and they've been doing it for 50 years, and every time they say, hey, we're not going to do it, we're going to take a piece because schools, people are like, no. And so honestly, part of our feeling is we get across the line, and once people are getting their carbon dividend, they're not going to give it up. And that's part of what we keep as durable legislation, right? So those are some reasons why we think it's different this time. And yeah. So thank you all for coming out tonight. There are cupcakes. Please fill out your letters. We got volunteers. Come talk with us. Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate you coming out tonight. Yep. Okay, yeah, sure. Let me. You have cards back here? Somewhere, yes. Let me go get them.